Our reading this morning is Strangers at the Door by Erica Hewitt. This is the March 7th, 2018 version of Braver, Wiser, a weekly source of inspiration from our UUA's Worship Web that you can sign up for if you'd like at the UUA Worship Web website. They always begin with a quote, have a reflection, and end with a prayer. The quote is, "Share the good news at all times. If necessary, use words," by St. Francis of Assisi, paraphrased. Ding dong! When my friend Beth answered her door one day, she found a pair of earnest Mormon missionaries, young men wishing to chat with her about their religion. Beth being Beth, she invited her visitors in, listened to what they had to say, and in response shared her good news, her beliefs about justice and inclusion, of being responsible for the most vulnerable among us, of countering oppression with love. The point wasn't to change their minds, and the missionaries must have realized that they weren't going to change hers either. Beth's intention was to create a moment of connection beyond, or in spite of, opposing beliefs. At the end of their visit, one of the Mormons asked, "Shall we pray together before we leave?" "Yes," said Beth, "I'll go first." And so she said a prayer, and then the missionaries said a prayer, and they parted ways. Days went by, the weather grew oppressively hot. Again, one afternoon, Beth heard her doorbell. On her doorstep were the same missionaries, wilting in the harsh sun. "Can we have some water?" one of them asked. "Hello," replied Beth. "I was thirsty and you gave me drink. Of course, come in." The young man drank their water, thanked her, and left. Beth never saw them again, but those missionaries have never left my mind, because their story forces me to examine my own heart and the way its doors sometimes stay stubbornly closed. If you or I know that there is a stranger suffering from thirst outside our door, wouldn't we readily bring them water? But in order to offer that hospitality, we first have to identify ourselves, sometimes in inconvenient or uncomfortable ways, as helpers, as willing to offer kindness or connection to someone we might disagree with. Of all the doors that they'd knocked on, in all the neighborhoods in Beth's town, a pair of devoted Mormons sought help from Beth, not just because she had embodied the religion of kindness, but also because she had risked opening her door to them the first time they visited. Her prayer. I never leave your current great ocean of mercy and storm, and so we both know that I could be kinder to strangers, whom I am sometimes tempted to judge. Help me to demonstrate loving kindness to everyone I encounter, for my actions may speak louder than my words. So I do not have a prepared sermon today. I am trusting you to ask me questions about generosity. When I was serving our congregation in Tarpon Springs, after about a couple of years of being there, I started finding that being in conversation with congregants, I felt that they had something really deep that they wanted to share, but did not want to force them to be confined to preparing an entire service themselves. And so I started this practice of being in conversation with a congregant in Tarpon Springs about something. And it was always up to their choice or my inspiration that led them some particular way. And we'd be in conversation about those things together. And so instead of offering a formal sermon, I would have the opportunity to answer questions live in front of the congregation, sometimes without any preparation about what those questions were. And so I'm offering you the opportunity to ask me questions today about generosity. This summer, our faith, our people, the people of our faith, We are a democratic, for people who don't know us, we are a democratically led and embodying, practicing faith. And for the last 4-ish years, our congregants and congregations have been in conversation about changing our perception of not only who we are or our understanding of who we are, but also who we want to be. And so this summer, our 7 principles and 6 sources that we have been clinging to very tightly for about 45 years have transitioned into 6 new values. And so this is the beginning of an opportunity to get to know the values a bit better. This first one is generosity. The next value is justice, and there's equity, transformation, interdependence, and pluralism, all centered on a liberating love. So the description for generosity that is found in our new UUA bylaws, Article 2, for all those times when people say bylaws aren't important, I think the last 4 years have demonstrated that we do have some attachment to bylaws. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. So I would be delighted to take a question from someone. Okay. Or if you shout it out, I'll repeat it until we get the mic situation handled. Yes.
Recently, on my Facebook page, I put up something in regards to Christianity and following Jesus and giving to people, being generous towards the stranger and immigrants and things like that. And I had somebody who put up, but Jesus, I don't know if it was Jesus, but they said, but you got to take care of your family first. That's the rules. And I didn't know how to answer that about taking family first.
Yeah.
Hello?
So I
Hello?
think each of us, did everybody hear the question? No. Okay. So on a Facebook post, there was a comment about Jesus saying that we have to be generous with all people, with the most vulnerable among us. And somebody replied as a comment that you have to be able to be generous with your own family first. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. So, of course, I think it's appropriate to be generous with your family first and to make sure that they're provided for. And also, over and over again, cultivating a practice of generosity means that you share with the stranger as well, and find ways. If we look at the scriptures, even when people didn't have a lot, and going back to the story I told today, even too, like maybe people don't have necessarily enough, but if you're really committed to the practice of generosity, you still give from what you have and pray that you will be taken care of as time unfolds. My own practice would be, that would be my own practice, is to give generously from what I have. Yes, prioritizing my family on the regular, but also being able to give to others as well. But I think also, everybody needs to find their own way and what's a good balance for them. I don't want to say that people aren't Christian if they're not following that practice, but I do think that the scriptures, both the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures, over and over again, convey that message that we are to be generous with one another, as a practice not only of generosity, but also of community building and sharing resources. That answer your question? Okay. We'll do Myra after Jerry.
Thank you for doing this. And I will note to start with,
I didn't prepare. But I'll wing it somehow.
You and me both.
I have a question about the extent of giving, and it stems from a young man he's 43 years old, lives with his mother, and he's bipolar. And he has discovered that his mission in life is to save me from everything. And so he is my guardian. He checks in with me maybe 3 or 4 times a day. If I'm out in the yard working, he brings me water. And the night before last, yes, it was maybe last night. I'm so muddled because he doesn't have a time frame, and mine is rather sketchy. But we were on my lanai, and he was talking. I was listening, and that's my job when I'm with him, because he just talks and talks, and his brain works at a different speed than mine, and goes in different places than mine has ever been. And so I sit and listen to him. We have a conversation, sort of, and I ask questions. And I'm wondering if that's enough, knowing that his mother is living with all of this. But he keeps saying, I'm half as old as you are, you're wiser than I am, and then he goes on to talk forever. And I have a hard time between wanting to help and being angry that he's taking up time that I could be spending in another way. So I don't know what I'm asking, but is it okay to be sort of mediocre in this?
I think that whatever kindness that we can offer to people is important, which is not to say that we shouldn't have boundaries and keep good boundaries and all of that. But I think that whatever kindness we can extend to people is important and meaningful. And it really sounds like you have had an impactful presence with this man. I think it's very lovely. So many of you know I worked as a chaplain, and there were a lot of conversations that I had with people, especially when I was working with people who had mental illness, who were hospitalized for it, that certainly did not fill my needs, but also that wasn't the purpose. That was never the purpose. They're not meant to fill my needs. I'm meant to fill theirs. And so listening and allowing people that space to process and explore and just feel heard just for a bit, even if you don't feel like you're doing as good of a job as you might or aren't really invested in it, if that person has the experience to feel heard, that's one of the greatest gifts that we can give one another. Is that helpful? Okay. Myra has a question. Okay. And we'll get to you next.
I'm unmuted. I can do it. I've heard that there's generosity of faith. Could you give me a few examples of how we could do that?
Yes, that is a good question. Generosity of faith. So I think it shows up in a lot of ways. I think that the way that this congregation generally receives newcomers, I hope our newcomers can validate or not this statement, that the way that this congregation receives newcomers is definitely an expression of that generosity of faith. the way that we are in relationship with one another. I know that there's always an eye toward the budget, but also people try to be mindful of how to open our practices, sometimes even just a little bit wider than they are, to be more embracing with that faith. I know that there has been some interest in learning some more social justice, developing better relationships with some of the social justice organizations in the area, which is just kind of an ongoing quest for any of our congregations, but that's another way that we practice our generosity of faith. And helping lead and practice our faith, not just in the privacy of our congregation or in the privacy of our own homes, but also in the public eye. I know that this congregation has before done the 1619 project, did a review of that material, invited the public in. We've been doing the forums. We've got the guy who's going to be doing the great discussions. Is that what it's called?
Great decisions.
Decisions course that's going to be offered. We have something that we're cooking up for this congregation to offer again this year that I'm not ready to share about yet. But those are all, I think, really good ways to talk about our generosity of faith and thinking about the ways that generosity has been framed in the bylaws, that we cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope, that we covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. I will say too, another thing that I just thought of as I was reading this is the program where you do the scholarships for people who are registering to become like medical assistants or doing trades. I was so impressed that you guys do that. I think that that's a really under-acknowledged area, and I just have been so delighted that you guys do that program. So I think that all of these kinds of things are expressions of the generosity of faith of this congregation.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
My question. Hello?
Took so long, the battery ran.
Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Hello? Hello? Okay, better?
I think so.
Okay. Anyway, my question is about generosity of spirit. I find it's easier to greet people and feel good toward them that maybe people I don't know so well. I find a way, well, I'll make excuses if they're a little, their thinking is different. However, I have a problem, especially recently, when someone I consider, or more than one, people that I consider friends, people I feel connected with, have differences, and in particular, most recently with this last election, people whose thinking is different than mine, who voted different than I did. I find I'm very disappointed and feel very let down, and I'm seeing them differently. And while I'm not shutting them out of my life, because that's not who I am, and that's not what this faith encourages me to be, but I'm having trouble with that. So any thoughts you have on that subject, I appreciate hearing. Thank you.
I think that's one of the hardest challenges of this moment in time for us. This place is where we are as a country, and I think it's something that we all struggle with. I know I struggle with it a lot. In some ways, I felt like it was easier to be present to people when I was a chaplain, and I was present to all sorts of stuff. especially when I was at the VA, which tends to be very conservative, not entirely, but tends to be very conservative. And I'd be listening to people talk about whatever they were talking about, and just be like, oh, personally, like I like cringing inside. And I felt like it was easier when it was my job, right? That it was my job to hold space and be present for people. Whereas like out in the world, like that's not what I have to show up for. And yet, I think that continuing to be present is the best thing that we can do. And honestly, I would be inclined, possibly if I were you, to say that you're disappointed, that you've been hurt by the things that people have done. That's how we actually practice being in real relationship with one another, is being able to share with one another, when not just when we've done good things together, but when we've hurt one another. And to explain, possibly why, whether it has impacted you personally or has impacted someone in this congregation or somebody else that you know, just to be able to say, I appreciate that we are not in the same place. I appreciate that things have been really hard for all of us for however many years you want to name. And also, this outcome has hurt me because of these particular things. And all we can do, it's hard. Relationships are hard because we can't control the outcome, right? Like we don't know how people are going to react. And they might just be like, well, tough luck later. And we don't have any control over that. But I think continuing to practice doing the best that we can do, tapping into our own sense of faith, the strength of our faith, and reminding ourselves that certainly we have nothing to be ashamed of, and that we're hoping for betterness in whatever forms it can take, even in that small moment, is worth making the space for. Last year, I finally got to read Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy. And among the different things that she talks about in that is that one of the key points, one of many, but one of them is that small is all, and that there is no experience too small to matter. And the ways that we are in relationship with one another is really the only way that we can ever impact anything. We can't change the outcome of the presidential election, right? It's not like one person versus the presidential election, right? It's those interactions that we have one-to-one that are going to make the difference, and that we actually even have any control over. I think it's completely natural to feel despair or disappointment or frustration or anger or just deep, deep sadness over the election outcomes. And our work as Unitarian Universalists certainly is to do that small is all, and to keep being in relationship with others as best we can. That being said, also like not to the detriment of your selfhood, right? So keeping good boundaries if it starts to hurt too much and you can't maintain it, but finding ways to continue to practice that generosity of spirit. I also think, okay, just one second. I've done a whole service on this. I actually preached it last weekend for another congregation about generosity of spirit also being a temporal thing. So it's not just in the one-to-one relationships that we're having now, but the relationships that have formed us and the relationships that we're passing down to. And so finding a way to try to remember that the connections are not just horizontal and in this particular moment, but thinking about, as people who came to the Women's March heard me talk about my grandmothers and the world that they raised me in, and this not being the world that they raised me in, not being the world that I was promised, and yet they raised me in a world that does not yet exist so that I could help pave the way for making it. And so thinking about that as a generosity of spirit, as an anchor as well, can be helpful.
Sonia.
Hey, good morning. Hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. My question, I was thinking, what is generosity? because in my line of work as a healthcare giver, you find that you'll come across people, I've come across coworkers who are like, I'm just doing this for the money. I need to pay my bills. I'm like, okay. What you do is different from what I do. We do the same thing, but in some sense it's different. And last night I was at work and my client was like, you're so generous. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, for everything you're doing, because she lives with her dog, no husband, no children. And she's like, my caregivers are my family. And I'm like, really? And we got to talking. In the midst of that, my mom called me from Jamaica. And she was like, you remember Mr. John Hamilton who you helped way back when? And I'm like, yes. He just came by the house and he gave me a bag full of food, ground food, yam, banana, fruits, and said to give it to you. I'm like, okay, tell him thank you. And she went on to say, he's thanking me for my generosity towards him. This gentleman, I helped him like 15 years ago. He was blind in both eyes. I did a fund at my workplace and I was able to raise enough money so he could do his operation. He's seeing, he's able to work and provide for himself instead of depending on people to hand him things, right? And I used to see him where someone would be drinking a bottle of water and because he's begging, they pour the water on him. And it used to hurt me to the core. And that was the reason I actually started the fund for him. It's still going on. It's helping quite a few other people back home. You understand? Because my mom continued it and a few nurses from the clinic. But I'm like, is generosity only to offer your resources, your presence, and your faith? Does it ask for more? Can you give more to broaden the word generosity?
Thank you. I feel like you just preached the whole sermon and we're good. I think that whatever ways that we can be generous is, yes, absolutely. I mean, in our congregations, we always talk about time, talent, and treasure. And yes, absolutely, those are ways to be generous. But there is that generosity of spirit that we were talking about, the ways that we are with one another, not just our presence, but the kindness that we offer one another. I did this service and, I started thinking about the ways that not just are we generous with one another in this particular moment laterally, but again, like that idea of generosity that's been handed down to us and generosity that's being asked of us of the future. Are other ways to be thinking about generosity so that we don't feel as sort of like the rug's been pulled out from underneath us, right? That we continue to feel that sense of what we value, what we hold to be true amongst each other. So yeah, any way that we can think of to be generous with one another, and absolutely taking on the opportunity to do a interpersonal GoFundMe to provide for somebody who is in need of assistance. Something happened recently. I don't remember what colleague I think posted about having to be hospitalized, and it broke my heart that GoFundMe is still like the largest medical provider right now. But that idea that people showing up for one another and providing for one another, and I am involved in a couple of mutual aid groups that make requests from just people on Facebook, like, hey, we've got a family in need. We need to provide for them right now. What can you offer? Hey, we need formula. It's this particular kind if you're local, and if you're not, we need some support with that. And just seeing how people can respond to it in different times and in different ways is just, there's a healing component to it, I think, that is a really lovely experience when practicing generosity. Yes,
I'm looking at the time here.
yes.
Maybe
Oh.
Bill should be our last one.
Okay.
Years ago, I was really influenced by a movie called Pay It Forward.
Uh-huh.
A young man was given the assignment to write a paper, and he wrote a paper on how if he went out and did a kindness for an individual who then wanted to reply to his goodness, he says, okay, just go out and find 3 other people and pass that kindness on to them. That satisfies your need to pay me back. And it was just so well designed that it really, and it altered my life, the way I dealt with generosity. And then there's always the good old thing, this is do unto others that you want others to do unto you. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, Bill.
Is there time for one more?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Thank you. I love the story today, and I love that concept of we can build walls or we can build a bigger table. And I wanted to think in terms of congregations. I've been poor and I've been rich in my life. When we were really young, we were pretty poor. I remember one classic Christmas time, we had $13, huge family, relatives to invite, 4 kids that wanted presents, and my family somehow did it, And my mother always jokes that was the best Christmas ever because she went to John's bargain store and bought all these 50-cent toys. And we were just feeling the abundance. And yet my family has, in our history, done really well, and people get more. Everyone's living off of me, very spiteful about sharing, protective of the things that we have. And I think that happens in congregations too. Because I notice, when people don't have a lot, they're willing to give a lot.
Absolutely.
And when we have a lot of abundance, we talk about abundance almost every week, we worry we're going to lose it. And I'm wondering, how can we take this message of generosity and abundance and bring it to our own, congregation and other congregations like us?
Yeah, it's a hard question because churches as institutions are generally rather conservative, low/no risk when possible. And so it can be really hard to navigate that sense because there's an obligation to the institution to keep it functioning, to keep it living for as long as the foreseeable future at least, and for generations to come. And so, of course, that entirely makes sense. And yet we've got this value now that asks us to be generous, to be more open with our practices. And so there's always going to be that tension that exists. And I think it's one of the things that I'm trying to work on with this congregation as well as UUCLC, which is yes, the things that we're doing are really good, and also we can push on that a little bit more. We can see where a new boundary might be. We can see if we can practice being more generous. Thinking again of Adrienne Marie Brown's "Small is All." How are the ways that we can cultivate changes in our practices and in our thinking that can open us up to being more generous, to having more justice, to having more equity, to being more interdependent, to being more transformative, to being more pluralistic, and to ultimately be practicing the liberating love that we're called to ultimately. So I don't have any specific answer for that at this point in time, but I have noticed a shift even in my time with this congregation that things are changing a little bit. We're thinking a little bit differently. I'm going to keep pushing on it where I feel like it's appropriate, but and so one way is not. I feel like again, institutions do what institutions do, and they institutionalize, and that's really great. And also, can be really tiring, right? Like we have expectations of like, oh, well, this is what we were able to do like 2 years ago. So we want to be able to continue to do all of these things. And it gets to be too much, right? We can't, like 2 years ago, it was novel and people were excited. And 2 years later, people are like, oh, make it stop. And so how can we make a more generous opportunity for the like, ugh, make it stop, that is more satisfying, not only for that person, but for everyone as a whole? So that's the tension, and we'll keep playing with it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Okay, I should stop talking now.